2. Yang Chu, egoist. An Epicurean determinist, the case for wickedness. Meanwhile, a precisely opposite doctrine had found vigorous expression among the Chinese. Yang Chu, of whom we know nothing except through the mouths of his enemies, announced paradoxically that life is full of suffering and that its chief purpose is pleasure. There is no God, said Yang, and no afterlife. Men are the helpless puppets of the blind natural forces that made them, and that gave them their unchosen ancestry and their inalienable character. The wise man will accept this fate without complaint, but will not be fooled by all the nonsense of Confucius and Moti about inherent virtue, universal love, and a good name. Morality is a deception practiced upon the simple by the clever. Universal love is the delusion of children who do not know the universal enmity that forms the law of life. And a good name is a posthumous bauble which the fools who paid so dearly for it cannot enjoy. In life the good suffer like the bad, and the wicked seem to enjoy themselves more keenly than the good. The wisest men of antiquity were not moralists and rulers, as Confucius supposed, but sensible sensualists who had the good fortune to antedate the legislators and the philosophers, and to enjoy the pleasures of every impulse. It is true that the wicked sometimes leave a bad name behind them, but this is a matter that does not disturb their bones. Consider, says Yang Chu, the fate of the good and the evil. All agree in considering Shun, Yu, Zhou Kun, and Confucius to have been the most admirable of men, and Jie and Zhou the most wicked. Now Shun had to plow the ground on the south of the Ho, and to play the potter by the Lei Lake. His forelimbs had not even a temporary rest. For his mouth and belly he could not even find pleasant food and warm clothing. No love of his parents rested upon him, no affection of his brothers and sisters. When Yao at length resigned to him the throne, he was advanced in age. His wisdom was decayed. His son, Shang Chun, proved without ability, and he had finally to resign the throne to Yu. Sorrowfully came he to his death. Of all mortals never was one whose life was so worn out and empoisoned as his. All the energies of Yu were spent on his labors with the land. A child was born to him, but he could not foster it. He passed his door without entering. His body became bent and withered. The skin of his hands and feet became thick and callous. When at length Shun resigned to him the throne, he lived in a low, mean house, though his sacrificial apron and cap were elegant. Sorrowfully came he to his death. Of all mortals never was one whose life was so saddened and embittered as his. Confucius understood the ways of the ancient sovereigns and kings. He responded to the invitations of the princes of his time. The tree was cut down over him in Sung. The traces of his footsteps were removed in Wei. He was reduced to extremity in Shang and Zhou. He was surrounded in Chan and Xi. He was disgraced by Yang Hu. Sorrowfully came he to his death. Of all mortals never was one whose life was so agitated and hurried as his. These four sages during their lives had not a single day's joy. Since their death they have had a fame that will last through myriads of ages, but that fame is what no one who cares for what is real would choose. Celebrate them, they do not know it. Reward them, they do not know it. Their fame is no more to them than to the trunk of a tree or a clod of earth. On the other hand, Jie came into the accumulated wealth of many generations. To him belonged the honor of the royal seat. His wisdom was enough to enable him to set at defiance all below. His power was enough to shake the world. He indulged the pleasures to which his eyes and ears prompted him. He carried out whatever it came into his thoughts to do. Brightly came he to his death. Of all mortals never was one whose life was so luxurious and dissipated as his. Zhou, Xin, came into the accumulated wealth of many generations. To him belonged the honor of the royal seat. His power enabled him to do whatever he would. He indulged his feelings in all his palaces. He gave the reins to his lusts through the long night. He never made himself bitter by the thought of propriety and righteousness. Brightly came he to his destruction. Of all mortals never was one whose life was as abandoned as his. These two villains, during their lives, had the joy of gratifying their desires. Since their death, they have had the evil fame of folly and tyranny, but the reality of enjoyment is what no fame can give. Reproach them, they do not know it. Praise them, they do not know it. Their ill fame is no more to them than the trunk of a tree or a clod of earth. How different all this is from Confucius. Again, we suspect that Time, who is a reactionary, has preserved for us the most respectable of Chinese thinkers, and has swallowed nearly all the rest in the limbo of forgotten souls. And perhaps Time is right. Humanity itself could not long survive if many were of Yang Chu's mind. The only answer to him is that society cannot exist if the individual does not cooperate with his followers in the give and take, the bear and forbear, of moral restraints. And a developed individual cannot exist without society. Our life depends upon those very limitations that constrain us. Some historians have found in the spread of such egoist philosophies part cause of that disintegration which marked Chinese society in the 4th and 3rd centuries before Christ. No wonder that Mencius, the Dr. Johnson of his age, raised his voice in scandalized protest against the Epicureanism of Yang Chu, as well as against the idealism of Moti. The words of Yang Chu and Moti fill the world. If you listen to people's discourses about it, you will find that they have adopted the views of the one or the other. Now Yang's principle is each for himself, which does not acknowledge the claims of the sovereign. Mo's principle is to love all equally, which does not acknowledge the peculiar affection due to a father. To acknowledge neither king nor father is to be in the state of a beast. If their principles are not stopped and the principles of Confucius set forth, their perverse speaking will delude the people and stop up the path of benevolence and righteousness. I am alarmed by these things and address myself to the defense of the doctrines of the former sages and to oppose Yang and Mo. I drive away their licentious expressions, so that such perverse speakers may not be able to show themselves. When sages shall rise up again, they will not change my words. 3. Mencius, mentor of princes. A model mother, a philosopher among kings. Are men by nature good? Single tax, Mencius and the communists, the profit motive, the right of revolution. Mencius, destined to be second in fame to Confucius alone in the rich annals of Chinese philosophy, belonged to the ancient family of Mang. His name, Mang Ko, was changed by an imperial decree to Mang Tse, that is, Mang the master or philosopher, and the Latin-trained scholars of Europe transformed him into Mencius, as they have changed Kung Fu Tse into Confucius. We know the mother of Mencius almost as intimately as we know him, for Chinese historians who have made her famous as a model of maternity recount many pretty stories of her. Thrice, we are told, she changed her residence on his account. Once because they lived near a cemetery and the boy began to behave like an undertaker. Another time because they lived near a slaughterhouse and the boy imitated too well the cries of the slain animals. And again because they lived near a marketplace and the boy began to act the part of a tradesman. Finally, she found a home near a school and was satisfied. When the boy neglected his studies, she cut through in his presence the thread of her shuttle. And when he asked why she did so destructive a thing, she explained that she was but imitating his own negligence and the lack of continuity in his studies and his development. He became an assiduous student, married, resisted the temptation to divorce his wife, opened a school of philosophy, gathered a famous collection of students about him, and received invitations from various princes to come and discuss with them his theories of government. He hesitated to leave his mother in her old age, but she sent him off with a speech that endeared her to all Chinese males, and may have been composed by one of them. It does not belong to a woman to determine anything of herself, but she is subject to the rule of the 3 obediences. When young, she has to obey her parents. When married, she has to obey her husband. When a widow, she has to obey her son. You are a man in your full maturity, and I am old. Do you act as your conviction of righteousness tells you ought to do, and I will act according to the rule which belongs to me. Why should you be anxious about me? He went, for the itch to teach is a part of the itch to rule. Scratch the one and find the other. Like Voltaire, Mencius preferred monarchy to democracy, on the ground that in democracy it is necessary to educate all if the government is to succeed, while under monarchy it is only required that the philosopher should bring one man, the king, to wisdom, in order to produce the perfect state. Correct what is wrong in the prince's mind. Once rectify the prince, and the kingdom will be settled. He went first to Qi, and tried to rectify its Prince Xuan. He accepted an honorary office, but refused the salary that went with it, and soon finding that the prince was not interested in philosophy, he withdrew to the small principality of Tang, whose ruler became a sincere but ineffectual pupil. Mencius returned to Qi, and proved his growth in wisdom and understanding by accepting a lucrative office from Prince Xuan. When, during these comfortable years, his mother died, he buried her with such pomp that his pupils were scandalized. He explained to them that it was only a sign of his filial devotion. Some years later, Xuan set out upon a war of conquest, and resenting Mencius's untimely pacifism, terminated his employment. Hearing that the Prince of Sung had expressed his intention of ruling like a philosopher, Mencius journeyed to his court, but found that the report had been exaggerated. Like the men invited to an ancient wedding feast, the various princes had many excuses for not being rectified. "I have an infirmity," one of them said. "I love valor." "I have an infirmity," said another. "I am fond of wealth." Mencius retired from public life and gave his declining years to the instruction of students and the composition of a work in which he described his conversations with the royalty of his time. We cannot tell to what extent these should be classed with those of Walter Savage Landor, nor do we know whether this composition was the work of Mencius himself, or of his pupils, or of neither, or of both. We can only say that the Book of Mencius is one of the most highly honored of China's philosophical classics. His doctrine is as severely secular as that of Confucius. There is little here about logic or epistemology or metaphysics. The Confucians left such subtleties to the followers of Lao Tse and confined themselves to moral and political speculation. What interests Mencius is the charting of the good life and the establishment of government by good men. His basic claim is that men are by nature good, and that the social problem arises not out of the nature of men, but out of the wickedness of governments. Hence philosophers must become kings, or the kings of this world must become philosophers. Now, if your majesty will institute a government whose action will be benevolent, this will cause all the officers in the kingdom to wish to stand in your majesty's court, and all the farmers to wish to plough in your majesty's fields, and all the merchants to wish to store their goods in your majesty's marketplaces, and all traveling strangers to wish to make their tours on your majesty's roads, and all throughout the kingdom who feel aggrieved by their rulers to wish to come and complain to your majesty. And when they are so bent, who will be able to keep them back?" The king said, "I am stupid, and not able to advance to this." The good ruler would war not against other countries, but against the common enemy, poverty, for it is out of poverty and ignorance that crime and disorder come. To punish men for crimes committed as the result of a lack of opportunities offered them for employment is a dastardly trap to set for the people. A government is responsible for the welfare of its people and should regulate economic processes accordingly. It should tax chiefly the ground itself, rather than what is built or done on it. It should abolish all tariffs and should develop universal and compulsory education as the soundest basis of a civilized development. Good laws are not equal to winning the people by good instruction. That whereby man differs from the lower animals is but small. Most people throw it away. Only superior men preserve it. We perceive how old are the political problems, attitudes, and solutions of our enlightened age when we learn that Mencius was rejected by the princes for his radicalism and was scorned for his conservatism by the socialists and communists of his time. When the shrike-tongued barbarian of the South, Shu Xing, raised the flag of the proletarian dictatorship, demanding that working men should be made the heads of the state, the magistrates, said Shu, should be laboring men, and many of the learned, then as now, flocked to the new standard, Mencius rejected the idea scornfully and argued that government should be in the hands of educated men. But he denounced the profit motive in human society and rebuked Sun Kang for proposing to win the kings to pacifism by persuading them, in modern style, of the unprofitableness of war. Your aim is great, but your argument is not good. If you, starting from the point of profit, offer your persuasive counsels to the kings of Qin and Qi, and if those kings are pleased with the consideration of profit so as to stop the movements of their armies, then all belonging to those armies will rejoice in the cessation of war, and will find their pleasures in the pursuit of profit. Ministers will serve the sovereign for the profit of which they cherish the thought. Sons will serve their fathers, and younger brothers will serve their elder brothers from the same consideration. And the issue will be that, abandoning benevolence and righteousness, sovereign and minister, father and son, younger brother and elder, will carry on all their intercourse with this thought of profit cherished in their breasts. But never has there been such a state of society without ruin being the result of it. He recognized the right of revolution and preached it in the face of kings. He denounced war as a crime and shocked the hero worshippers of his time by writing, "There are men who say, 'I am skillful at marshaling troops. I am skillful at conducting a battle.' They are great criminals." There has never been a good war, he said. He condemned the luxury of the courts and sternly rebuked the king who fed his dogs and swine while famine was consuming his people. When a king argued that he could not prevent famine, Mencius told him that he should resign. The people, he taught, are the most important element in a nation. The sovereign is the lightest. And the people have the right to depose their rulers, even, now and then, to kill them. The King Xuan asked about the high ministers. Mencius answered, "If the princes have great faults, they ought to remonstrate with him, and if he do not listen to them after they have done so again and again, they ought to dethrone him." Mencius proceeded, "Suppose that the chief criminal judge could not regulate the officers under him. How would you deal with him?" The king said, "Dismiss him." Mencius again said, "If within the four borders of your kingdom there is not good government, what is to be done?" The king looked to the right and left and spoke of other matters. The King Xuan asked, "Was it so that Tang banished Jie, and that King Wu smote Zhou?" Mencius replied, "It is so in the records." The king said, "May a minister put his sovereign to death?" Mencius said, "He who outrages the benevolence proper to his nature is called a robber. He who outrages righteousness is called a ruffian. The robber and the ruffian we call a mere fellow. I have heard of the cutting off of the fellow, Zhou, but I have not heard of putting a sovereign to death." It was brave doctrine, and had much to do with the establishment of the principle, recognized by the kings as well as the people of China, that a ruler who arouses the enmity of his people has lost the mandate of heaven, and may be removed. It is not to be marveled at that Hung Wu, founder of the Ming dynasty, having read with great indignation the conversations of Mencius with King Xuan, ordered Mencius to be degraded from his place in the Temple of Confucius, where a royal edict of 1084 had erected his tablet. But within a year the tablet was restored, and until the revolution of 1911, Mencius remained one of the heroes of China, the second great name and influence in the history of Chinese orthodox philosophy. To him and to Chu Shi, Confucius owed his intellectual leadership of China for more than 2,000 years.